9 days. That's all the notice gave her. She signed anyway. She had to. And somewhere on page 14, in language older than the country itself, she signed away more than rent. She didn't know it yet, but the building hadn't just been sold. She had. A king who drinks blood now owned her lease. And he had been waiting 200 years for exactly this signature. Her name was Ivy Callahan. And by the time she understood what she'd actually agreed to, it was already too late to undo it. The only question left was whether she'd survive what came next, or become one more name added to a ledger that stretched back further than anyone in her family had ever told her existed. Savannah keeps its secrets like old houses keep dust. Buried deep, never swept out. Tourists come for the ghost tours and leave by sunset. The locals know better. They know the city doesn't feel the same after dark. And they don't ask why. Ivy Callahan never asked why either. She didn't have the luxury. She had rent, 2 jobs, and 6 years of telling herself none of it was strange. That was about to end. She proofread contracts by day for a law office that handled property disputes nobody else wanted. She pulled shifts at a coffee shop by night, because one paycheck never covered anything in a city this expensive. She read fine print for a living. That skill was about to become the only thing standing between her and the thing that had just bought her building. Her apartment sat on the 2nd floor of an old townhouse with black shutters and a brick facade the color of dried blood. The landlord barely kept it standing. Broken locks. A radiator that worked 1 month a year. She stayed because she couldn't afford to leave, and because leaving had never felt like something she was allowed to want. Until the notice on the door changed everything. The notice came on a Tuesday. It was taped to the front door of the building, not slid under individual doors, which Ivy would later understand was its own kind of message. An announcement, not a courtesy. She read it standing on the stoop with her keys still in her hand, the county courthouse 2 blocks over ringing its bell for the top of the hour, and felt the particular cold drop in her stomach that comes from a piece of paper that is about to reorganize your entire life. The building at 114 Verity Lane, it read, has been sold. All current leases are terminated effective immediately. Tenants have 30 days to vacate unless a new lease agreement is executed with the incoming ownership group. Interested tenants should contact the property management office, listed below, to arrange terms. 30 days. Ivy read it twice, 3 times, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. They didn't. She thought about her savings account, which currently held enough to cover 1 month somewhere else if she didn't eat and didn't get sick, and nothing on her ancient car broke down. She thought about the 11 other units in the building, about Mrs. Okafor on the 1st floor who was 71 and used a cane, about the young couple upstairs, with the baby who cried through the walls some nights loud enough that Ivy had learned the particular rhythm of it. Hungry cry, tired cry, scared cry. She thought about all of them getting the exact same piece of paper, taped to the exact same door. And something in her, some old stubborn thing that had gotten her through 6 years of 2 jobs and a decaying apartment, decided that she was not simply going to pack a bag and disappear because a stranger with a law firm had bought the building out from under her. She called the number at the bottom of the notice that evening, sitting on the edge of her bed with the lamp on because the overhead light had been flickering for a week and she hadn't gotten around to replacing the bulb, mostly because Gerald Pruitt no longer answered his phone and she'd stopped expecting him to fix anything. The woman who answered had a voice like cool water over stone. unhurried, faintly accented in a way Ivy couldn't place. Old world in some indefinable manner that made her think of black and white films. She introduced herself as Margarethi, representative of the incoming ownership group, a private holding company called Verity Trust Partners. Ivy explained her situation. The job, the 6 years, the impossibility of finding anything comparable in 30 days on her income, and braced herself for the kind of scripted corporate apology that meant absolutely nothing. Instead, Margarethi said, "Miss Callahan, you are a current tenant of Unit 2. Is that correct?" "Yes. Your file indicates a lease renewal is available to you. You would simply need to come to the management office at your earliest convenience and sign the updated agreement. The terms are, I think you'll find, quite generous." Ivy had blinked at the phone, waiting for the catch. There was always a catch. "What kind of generous?" "Rent will not increase for the duration of your tenancy," Margarethi said. "In fact, given the transitional circumstances, the new ownership has authorized a reduction for tenants who sign within the first week. We would rather retain good tenants than lose them to a hasty market search." Does that sound acceptable? It sounded, frankly, too good to be believable. And Ivy had spent 6 years in a law office learning that the deals which sounded too good to be believable were usually the ones you needed a lawyer to read line by line before you signed anything. But she also knew what her bank account looked like, and what the rental market looked like, and the particular exhaustion of imagining herself boxing up her entire life in less than a month. And so she made an appointment for that Friday, and told herself she would read every single word of the new lease before she put her name on it. The management office turned out to be a narrow storefront, 2 blocks from the building itself, sandwiched between a shuttered antique shop and a bakery that smelled like cardamom, its windows tinted dark enough that Ivy could see her own reflection walking up to the door more clearly than she could see anything inside. A small brass plaque read Verity Trust Partners, Est 1836. And Ivy remembered thinking distantly that it was strange for a holding company to advertise a founding date nearly 2 centuries old, as though the number itself was meant to communicate something. Prestige, maybe? Or a warning, if you knew what to listen for. Inside, the office was cooler than the Savannah afternoon had any right to allow. The air conditioning turned up so high, Ivy felt goosebumps rise on her arms the moment she stepped through the door. Marguerite turned out to be a striking woman, somewhere between 40 and ageless, pale in the particular way that made Ivy think of porcelain rather than illness, dressed in charcoal wool despite the heat outside. Her silver blonde hair pinned in a style Ivy associated with old photographs rather than anything currently fashionable. She had a way of looking at Ivy that felt less like eye contact and more like an inventory being taken. Quick, precise, complete. "Miss Callahan," Margaret said, gesturing to a chair across a mahogany desk, bare of everything except a leather folio and a fountain pen. "Punctual. I appreciate that in a tenant." The lease sat inside the folio, and Ivy did what she had told herself she would do. She read it, all 14 pages of it, slower than Margarethi likely wanted, asking questions about clauses that seemed unusual, a stipulation about quiet hours that was oddly specific to nighttime rather than daytime, a clause granting building management the right to enter units for maintenance without the standard 24-hour notice under circumstances described only as necessary for the safety of the property. Margarethy answered each question smoothly, patiently, with the practiced calm of someone who had done this exact negotiation more times than Ivy could imagine, and every answer sounded reasonable enough on its own that Ivy's suspicion, never quite gone, never quite confirmed, sat uneasily, somewhere behind her sternum, the entire time. There was one clause, near the bottom of page 14, written in smaller type than the rest, that Ivy read twice, and still didn't fully understand. It referenced something called the original tenancy accord of the property, dated 1836, and stated that any current or future occupant of the premises inherited certain obligations and protections under that original accord, transferable by blood or by residence at the discretion of the property's rightful holder. Ivy had asked what that meant. Practically, for her, legal boilerplate, Margaret had said, waving a pale hand as if brushing away a fly. A holdover from the property's original charter. It has no bearing on your day-to-day tenancy. Landlords in this city cling to old paperwork the way old families cling to old grudges. It costs nothing to leave it in. It costs a great deal historically to remove it. It should have bothered her more than it did. Ivy would think about that later, when there was no longer any comfortable way to pretend she hadn't been warned, in her own way, by her own instincts, and had signed anyway because she was tired and scared and the rent was $300 a month cheaper than what she'd been paying Gerald Pruitt for a building with a broken back door and one working radiator. She signed on page 14. She signed on page 15. Margaret smiled, a small, satisfied thing, and slid a brass key across the desk, heavier than the key Ivy had been using for 6 years, old-fashioned in its design, cool to the touch, even in the overcooled office. "Welcome home, Miss Callahan," Margaretha said. "I do think you'll find the new management considerably more attentive than the old." She wasn't wrong about that, at least. Within a week of the sale, the back door of the building had a new lock that actually caught. The radiator in the hallway ran warm, even though it wasn't yet cold enough outside to need it. And a crew of quiet, efficient men in dark coveralls had repainted the lobby, a deep burgundy that made the whole building feel, for the first time since Ivy had lived there, like somewhere worth coming home to. Mrs. Okafor on the first floor got a new stairlift installed at no cost to her, which she mentioned to Ivy in the hallway with the kind of disbelieving gratitude usually reserved for miracles. The young couple upstairs stopped complaining about the water pressure. It was, on the surface of things, the best thing that had happened to 114 Verity Lane in as long as anyone could remember. But Ivy noticed things. She had spent 6 years training her eyes to catch inconsistencies buried in dense paragraphs of legal text, and that same instinct, the one that flagged a misplaced comma, changing the meaning of an entire contract clause, had apparently not switched off just because she was home. She noticed that the maintenance men never came during the day. She noticed that the new intercom system installed at the front entrance had a camera that seemed to track movement, even when the building was, as far as she knew, completely empty of visitors. She noticed that Margaretha herself stopped by twice in the first month, always in the late evening, always dressed as though she'd stepped out of a formal event rather than a property inspection, moving through the halls with a silence that unsettled Ivy in a way she couldn't articulate. Footsteps should make sound on old hardwood. Margaretha's didn't, or if they did, Ivy never once managed to hear them coming. She noticed, most of all, a man. She saw him first from her window, on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after the sale. standing on the sidewalk across the street, looking up at the building with the specific, unhurried attention of someone studying a piece of architecture rather than passing by. He wore a dark coat despite the mild evening, tailored in a way that made Ivy think, absurdly, of old portraits in museums, the kind of clothing that belonged to a different century entirely. He was tall, and even from 2 stories up and across the street, there was something in the stillness of him, an economy of movement that read as unnatural the longer she watched it, that made the hair on the back of Ivy's neck rise before her conscious mind had assembled a single coherent reason why. He looked up, directly at her window. Directly, she would have sworn, at her. Ivy stepped back from the glass so fast she knocked her elbow against the windowsill, heart hammering with an intensity that felt wildly disproportionate to the actual event. A stranger, looking at a building, nothing more. And yet, every instinct in her body screamed that she had just been seen the way a woman is seen by something that considers itself a predator and herself, whether she liked it or not, prey. When she worked up the courage to look again, 30 seconds later, hands still faintly trembling, the sidewalk was empty. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself the same thing 3 days later, when she came home from her coffee shop shift at 11 at night to find the lobby lit only by a single lamp, the burgundy walls looking almost black in the low light, and the same man standing at the base of the staircase as though he had been waiting for her, one hand resting on the newel post, watching the front door with the patience of someone for whom time did not carry the same weight it carried for her. "Miss Callahan," he said, before she had said a single word, before she had even fully processed that he knew her name. His voice did something to the air in the room. That was the only way Ivy could describe it to herself later. Lying awake with the lamp on and the new deadbolt thrown and the chair from her kitchen table wedged uselessly under the doorknob, as if a chair could stop something that moved the way he moved. His voice hadn't been loud. It hadn't needed to be. It was low and smooth, and carried an old, unplaceable cadence, the vowels shaped by an accent that belonged to no country Ivy could name, and it settled into the room the way cold settles into a house in winter, quietly, completely, until you realized you'd been shivering for several minutes without noticing when it started. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" Ivy had asked, proud later of how steady her voice had come out, even though her pulse was doing something frantic and uneven behind her ribs. "Not yet," he said. "I am Julian Voss. I believe you've recently become one of my tenants." Ivy's mind had gone. Briefly. Blank. "I thought the building was owned by Verity Trust Partners." "It is." Something that might have been amusement moved across his face, there and gone before she could be certain of it. "I am Verity Trust Partners, Miss Callahan, in the sense that matters, Margrave handles the paperwork. I handle everything paperwork cannot describe." She should have found that answer evasive, unsettling, a red flag large enough to wave from orbit. She did find it unsettling, but there was something else underneath the unease, something she resented herself for feeling even as she felt it, a pull she couldn't fully name, standing in a dim lobby at 11 at night, with a stranger who moved like he'd never once in his life needed to hurry, because he had already won whatever race he happened to be running. He was, she registered distantly, extraordinarily good-looking, in a way that felt less like genetics and more like design. dark hair, sharp angles to his face that looked carved rather than grown, and eyes that in the low lamplight seemed to shift between a very dark brown and something closer to black. Depending on the angle, Ivy would realize much later on how carefully he was controlling himself in that particular moment. "It's late," Ivy said, taking a step toward the stairs, toward her own door, toward anything that wasn't standing in an empty lobby, with a man whose stillness felt less like calm and more like a held breath. "I should get to bed. I have a shift in the morning." Of course. He didn't move to block her path, didn't do anything that could be construed later as aggressive or threatening, and that, too, unsettled her, the sense that he was allowing her to leave rather than being unable to stop her. "Sleep well, Miss Callahan. I hope you're finding the building to your satisfaction. If anything requires attention, you need only ask." She had gone up to her apartment and locked the door and stood with her back against it for a long moment, breathing, trying to catalogue exactly what about the encounter had frightened her so thoroughly when nothing, technically, had happened. A landlord had introduced himself. That was all. Landlords were allowed to introduce themselves to tenants in the lobby of their own building, and yet Ivy had lain awake long past midnight, staring at the ceiling, replaying the particular way his eyes had tracked her, not with the leering, invasive attention she'd learned to flinch away from in bars and on sidewalks over the years. Something else, something that felt closer to the way she imagined a collector might look at a piece they had been searching for across a very long time and had finally, unexpectedly, found. The following weeks fell into an uneasy rhythm. Julian Voss did not appear again immediately, and Ivy told herself, in the daylight hours, when the whole encounter felt faintly ridiculous, that she had simply met an eccentric, wealthy, socially peculiar man who happened to own her building, and that the fear she'd felt in that dim lobby had been an overreaction born of exhaustion and a long history of learning to be afraid of men in general. She went to her job at the law firm. She proofread title transfers and boundary surveys, and a nasty custody-adjacent property dispute between two brothers fighting over their dead mother's house. She pulled her coffee shop shifts. She came home, most nights, to a building that felt, despite everything, safer and warmer and better maintained than it had in the 6 years she'd lived there, under Gerald Pruitt's negligent ownership. But small things kept accumulating, the way small things do when you've trained yourself, professionally, to notice inconsistencies. She noticed that none of her neighbors ever seemed to see Julian Voss, not once. Not even the ones who had lived in the building since before the sale, and should have, by any reasonable logic, run into their landlord in the hallway at some point over the intervening weeks. She noticed that Mrs. Okafor, when Ivy carefully brought him up in conversation one afternoon on the front stoop, had looked at her with polite confusion and said she'd only ever dealt with a very nice woman named Margarethi. No gentleman by that name had ever introduced himself. She noticed that the new intercom camera at the front door, the one that seemed to track movement, never once picked up Julian Voss on the recordings the building's maintenance staff occasionally reviewed in front of tenants for security purposes, a blind spot that should not have been technically possible, and that nobody but Ivy seemed to find strange. She noticed, most unsettlingly of all, that she had started to feel, on certain nights, a specific and inexplicable sensation of being watched from somewhere just beyond the edge of her vision, a prickling awareness at the back of her neck that she could never quite trace to a source. that vanished the instant she turned to look for it, and that returned, reliably, every single time she worked a closing shift at the coffee shop and walked the 4 blocks home alone after midnight. She started walking faster on those nights. She started, without fully admitting it to herself, keeping her keys threaded between her fingers the way she'd learned in a self-defense class years ago, a habit she'd let lapse in a city that had started to feel, in recent years, like it was full of eyes she couldn't account for. It was on one of those late walks home, 3.5 weeks after signing the lease, that everything Ivy had been telling herself to dismiss stopped being dismissible. She had closed the coffee shop alone that night, her co-worker calling in sick with a stomach bug, the manager trusting Ivy with the keys because she'd worked there long enough to have earned it. The walk home took her down a quieter stretch of street, lined with old oaks, moss hanging heavy, and still in the windless night, streetlights spaced further apart than they should have been, throwing long stretches of shadow between each pool of orange light. Ivy had done this walk 100 times without incident. She had never once, until that night, felt genuinely certain that she was not alone on the sidewalk. The footsteps behind her were soft, deliberately soft, the kind of soft that comes from someone trying not to be heard, rather than someone who simply walks quietly, and Ivy's pulse spiked the moment she registered them. Some old animal part of her recognizing a predator's gait before her rational mind had finished constructing an innocent explanation. She quickened her pace. The footsteps quickened to match. She glanced back, once, quick, and caught the outline of a man crossing beneath a streetlight 2 blocks behind her. Average height, hood pulled up despite the mild night, moving with a purposeful directness that had nothing casual about it. She recognized him a half-second later, in the worst possible way, the sudden lurch of adrenaline turning her stomach to ice. It was Gerald Pruitt. Her former landlord had been furious about the sale from the moment it went through. Ivy would learn much later. Forced into it by debts she had never known about, debts that Verity Trust Partners had apparently bought up and called in with a speed and thoroughness that left him with no legal option but to sell the building at a price he considered an insult. He had lost the building, lost the income, lost, in his own mind, everything he had built. And in the weeks since, he had apparently decided that somewhere in the tangle of his misfortune, Ivy Callahan bore some blame. The tenant who had gone crawling to the new owners the fastest. The tenant whose rent had gone down while his own finances collapsed. Ivy didn't know any of that yet. Walking alone on a dark street, with her former landlord closing the distance behind her, she only knew fear, pure and immediate, the kind that strips language and reasoning down to a single instinct. Run. She ran. Gerald Pruitt ran faster. He caught her by the strap of her bag 2 blocks from her building, yanking her backward with a violence that spun her off her feet and slammed her shoulder into the brick wall of a darkened storefront, air punching out of her lungs in a single strangled gasp. He was breathing hard, reeking of whiskey. His face contorted into something Ivy had never seen on him in 6 years of interactions that had ranged from indifferent to mildly incompetent. Never once, until this moment, dangerous. "You think you're clever," he snarled, grabbing her by the shoulders and shoving her hard enough that her head cracked against the brick, stars bursting behind her eyes. "You went running to them first. Told them what a great tenant you were. You have any idea what they did to me? Any idea what I lost because of tenants like you? I didn't do anything, Ivy gasped, hands scrabbling uselessly against his grip, her voice thin with panic. Gerald, please, let go of me. You're going to fix this, he said. And there was something unhinged in his voice now. Something that had clearly been building for weeks, with nowhere to go. No target until this dark street handed him one. You're going to tell them you want out. Tell them the building's cursed. Tell them anything. I don't care. But you are not going to sit pretty in my building while I lose everything. He struck her, open-handed, hard enough across the face that Ivy's vision whited out for a half-second, her knees buckling, a sound tearing out of her that was somewhere between a scream and a sob. She hit the ground hard, palms scraping against the sidewalk. And Gerald Pruitt loomed over her, hand drawing back for another blow. And Ivy had just enough presence of mind left to think, with a strange, distant clarity, that this was how it ended, on a dark street 4 blocks from home, because she had gone to sign a lease that seemed too good to be true. The second blow never landed. The air around them changed with a suddenness that had nothing to do with weather, the temperature dropping so fast and so completely that Ivy felt her breath fog in front of her face, despite the mild savannah night. Every streetlight on the block flickering once, in unison, as if something enormous had just drawn all the available power toward itself. Gerald Pruitt's raised arm froze mid-motion. His face, twisted a moment ago into drunken rage, went slack with a confusion that curdled almost instantly into naked terror. "Remove your hand," said a voice Ivy recognized immediately. Low, resonant, carrying none of the mild civility it had held in the lobby weeks before. Stripped down now to something ancient and lethal. "From what belongs to me." Julian Voss stood behind Gerald Pruitt with no explanation for how he had arrived there. No sound of footsteps, no warning at all. Simply present in the space where a moment before there had been only empty sidewalk. Ivy, still on the ground, one hand pressed to her stinging cheek, stared up at him with a fear that had shifted in the space of a single breath, from the ordinary human fear of Gerald Pruitt's fists to something far larger and stranger, because Julian Voss's eyes, in the wash of the flickering streetlight, had gone entirely, impossibly red, twin points of dark crimson fire, where a moment before there had been ordinary dark brown, and his face, still handsome, still sharp-boned and aristocratic, had taken on an expression Ivy had no words for, something predatory and ancient, stripped of every polite pretense he had worn in her building's lobby. Gerald Pruitt turned, saw what stood behind him, and made a sound Ivy had never heard a grown man make. A high, wordless whimper of pure animal terror. "You," Julian said, and his voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the shadows pooling thick between the streetlights, from the air itself. "Have laid your hand on someone under my protection." I didn't know," Gerald stammered, backing away, tripping over his own feet, catching himself against the brick wall Ivy had been slammed into moments before. "Please, I'll leave. I'll never come near her again. I swear to God." "Please, you will not need God," Julian said, and closed the distance between them faster than Ivy's eyes could track. One instant standing several feet away, and the next with a pale hand wrapped entirely around Gerald Pruitt's throat, lifting him bodily off the ground with an ease that made a mockery of the man's considerable size, feet kicking uselessly in the air, hands clawing at the vice grip, crushing his windpipe. "Please don't kill him," Ivy heard herself say, the words coming out before she'd fully decided to say them. Some part of her still functioning enough to understand that whatever was happening in front of her, whatever Julian Voss actually was, murder in the street would leave a body, and a body would leave questions, and questions would leave her, somehow, at the center of something far worse than a broken lease. "Please, he's not worth it." Julian's crimson eyes flicked toward her, and for a long moment he simply looked at her. Gerald Pruitt, still dangling and choking in his grip, the two of them frozen in a tableau lit only by a stuttering street lamp. And something in his expression shifted, the fury banking, not vanishing, but folding itself down into something colder and more controlled. "As you wish," he said, and Ivy would spend a long time afterward turning that phrase over in her mind. The strange formality of it, the way it sounded less like a favor granted to a frightened woman and more like a debt being recorded. He didn't kill Gerald Pruitt. What he did instead, Ivy would only half understand in the moment, and fully understand much later, was lean close to the man's ear and murmur something too quiet for her to catch, a handful of words that made Gerald Pruitt's whole body go rigid, eyes wide and fixed and glassy. And when Julian finally released him, dropping him to the sidewalk in a crumpled, gasping heap, the man scrambled backward, up onto his feet, and ran, actually ran, down the dark street and around the corner without a single glance back, moving with a speed and a terror that a man his age and his level of drunkenness should not have been physically capable of producing. Ivy sat on the sidewalk, shaking, her shoulder throbbing where it had hit the brick, her cheek stinging, and looked up at the man who had just saved her life, with an expression she was fairly certain communicated every ounce of the fear she felt, not just of Gerald Pruitt, but of him, of whatever he actually was. Julian knelt in front of her, slowly, deliberately, the crimson in his eyes already receding back toward the dark, ordinary brown she remembered from the lobby. And for the first time since she'd met him, his expression held something that looked almost like gentleness. "You're bleeding," he said quietly, and reached toward her cheek, stopping his hand an inch from her skin. Waiting, she realized with a strange jolt, for permission. "What are you?" Ivy whispered, the question falling out of her before she could stop it, before she could weigh whether she actually wanted the answer. Julian's mouth curved, faintly, not quite a smile. "I think, Miss Callahan, you already know. I think some part of you has known since the moment you signed that lease, and has been very carefully not letting yourself think about it." She didn't answer, because he was right, and they both knew it. "May I?" he asked again, hand still hovering near her injured cheek. She nodded, because some strange, exhausted, adrenaline-scoured part of her trusted him more in that moment than she trusted the ordinary world she'd been living in an hour earlier. And his fingers, when they finally touched her skin, were cold as river water and gentler than she had any reason to expect from someone who had just lifted a grown man off the ground by his throat. "He won't come near you again," Julian said. "I gave him something to remember me by. He'll wake tomorrow with no clear memory of tonight beyond a conviction, bone deep, that this street, and you, are the one thing in the world he must never approach again. You erased his memory. I redirected it, Memory is a delicate architecture, Miss Callahan, easily rebuilt if you understand its foundations. I find it far more elegant than simply removing a man's throat, though I confess the temptation was significant. His thumb brushed, once, gently, along her jaw, and Ivy felt something in her chest tighten that had nothing to do with fear. "Can you stand?" She could. With his help, his hand steady and impossibly strong under her elbow. And the walk back to the building passed in a kind of shocked silence, Ivy's mind turning over everything she had just seen and everything she had spent 3.5 weeks refusing to fully acknowledge. Vampire. The word sat in her mind. Absurd. And yet, somehow, the only word that fit, the only explanation that accounted for the cold, the speed, the eyes, the way the streetlights had flickered, as though the entire electrical grid had briefly bowed to something older than electricity itself. At her door, Julian paused, releasing her arm gently, stepping back to a distance that felt, Ivy thought, deliberately respectful. The distance of someone who understood exactly how much he had just upended her sense of reality and was trying, in his own controlled way, not to compound it. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "More than one, I think. But not tonight. Tonight you should rest, and I should see to it that the man who hurt you never finds his way back to this street." "Why do you care?" Ivy asked. The question raw, exhausted, more honest than she'd intended. "About what happens to me. You don't know me. I'm a tenant. I'm nobody." Something crossed Julian's face then, quick and complicated, gone before Ivy could fully read it, though she would think about it for days afterward, turning it over the way she turned over an ambiguous clause in a contract, searching for the meaning hidden underneath the plain language. "You are not nobody, Ivy Callahan," he said quietly. "I think you may be the single most important thing that has happened to this city, and to me, in a very long time. But that is a conversation for a night when you are not bleeding and frightened and standing on your own doorstep. Sleep. Lock your door. I will be nearby. Whether or not you can see me." He was gone before she'd finished processing the sentence. The space where he'd stood simply empty. No sound of footsteps retreating. No shadow slipping around a corner. Just absence where a moment before there had been presence. And Ivy stood alone in the hallway for a long time before she found the strength to unlock her own door and go inside. She did not sleep well. She lay in bed with every light in the apartment on, replaying the crimson of his eyes, the ice of his hands, the impossible speed of his arrival, and underneath all of it, unwelcome and persistent, the strange gentleness in his voice when he'd asked, twice, for permission to touch her bleeding face. She thought about the clause on page 14 of her lease, the one about the original tenancy accord, transferable by blood or by residence, at the discretion of the property's rightful holder, and felt, for the first time, a cold certainty that whatever that clause actually meant, it was not the harmless legal boilerplate Margaretha had claimed it to be. She thought, too, about the way he had said, "single most important thing that has happened to this city, and to me," and could not, no matter how she turned it over, make herself believe that was a compliment. Morning brought a strange, hollowed-out calm, the kind that follows a night of genuine terror once the adrenaline has fully burned away and left only exhaustion in its place. Ivy called out of her coffee shop shift. unable to face the walk there and back after everything that had happened, and spent the day instead doing the thing she was actually trained to do, which was research. She drove to the county archives on Bay Street, the ones housed in a squat, unglamorous municipal building a few blocks from the more photogenic historic district, and asked the clerk on duty, an older man with reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, whether they had any property records for 114 Verity Lane going back to the building's original construction. He disappeared into the stacks for the better part of 20 minutes and came back with a thin folder of documents. Some of them original, most of them photostatic copies of paperwork too fragile to be handled directly by the public, and told her, apologetically, that Verity Lane's records were thinner than most because a fire in 1911 had destroyed a substantial portion of the county's early land grant archive, and what survived had been reconstructed from private collections decades later, incomplete, water-damaged. Hard to read. It was enough. It was. Ivy would come to understand. Exactly enough. The oldest surviving document referenced a land grant dated 1836, issued to a family whose name had been smudged illegible by water damage everywhere except one preserved fragment, a single surviving signature line at the bottom of a transfer deed. The letters faded, but legible if you held the page at the right angle to the window light. Callahan. Ivy stood in the dim archive room with the fragile page in her gloved hands, her own heartbeat suddenly very loud in her ears, staring at a signature nearly 200 years old that shared her exact surname in a city she had moved to 6 years ago for a job, with no family history here that she had ever been told about, no roots, no reason to have ended up renting an apartment in a building whose original ownership traced back to someone who might improbably share her blood. She thought about the clause. Transferable by blood or by residence. She thought about Julian Voss's face in the dark street, the way he had looked at her before he ever touched her injured cheek, an expression that was not. She understood now with a chill that had nothing to do with the archive's air conditioning. The expression of a man looking at a stranger. It was the expression of a man looking at something he had been searching for. She did not go back to the building that evening feeling safe. She went back understanding, for the first time, that she had never simply rented an apartment. She had walked, unknowing, into the middle of something that had been waiting, patiently, for nearly 2 centuries, and that whatever came next, whatever Julian Voss actually wanted from her, whatever her own family's forgotten history had bound her to before she was ever born, the choice to walk away from it had likely stopped being hers the moment she signed her name on page 14. That night, for the first time, she left her chain off the door, not because she felt safe, because some new, unfamiliar instinct told her that if Julian Voss wanted into her apartment, no chain in the world had ever been built that could stop him, and that the more urgent question, the one she needed answered before she could sleep at all, was not how to keep him out, but what, exactly, he intended to do now that he'd found her. She didn't have to wait long for the answer to start revealing itself. The knock came just after midnight, soft, almost hesitant, entirely unlike the silent, sudden way he had appeared on the street the night before, as though he understood that after everything, a door deserved to be knocked on rather than simply arrived behind. Ivy stood on the other side of it for a long moment, hand resting flat against the wood, feeling the strange magnetic certainty of exactly who was waiting on the other side. And then she opened it, because some part of her, exhausted and terrified and curious in equal measure, had already decided that she was done pretending she didn't want to know the truth. Julian Voss stood in the hallway dressed exactly as he had been the night before. Dark coat, sharp collar, hands folded in front of him with the patient stillness of someone who had learned, across a very long life, that the things worth having were rarely worth rushing. "I believe," he said quietly, "it's time I told you who you actually are, Ivy Callahan, and who your family has been, without your knowledge, for nearly 200 years. She stepped back from the door, wordless, and let him in. He did not sit until she offered him a seat. And even then he took the chair by the window rather than the couch beside her. A small, deliberate courtesy that Ivy noticed and appreciated more than she expected to, given that this was a man who had lifted another man off the ground by his throat less than 24 hours earlier. The apartment felt smaller with him in it, not because of his size, which was unremarkable, tall but not extraordinarily so, but because of the way the air itself seemed to organize around him, the way a room rearranges its silence around a held breath. "I want to start," Julian said, "by telling you that nothing you are about to hear was your fault. You did not choose this. You did not seek it out. I want that understood before anything else, because I suspect that once you know the whole of it, some part of you will look for a way to blame yourself for having walked into a management office and signed a lease you needed. You did nothing wrong, Ivy. You were simply born who you were born to be." "That's not comforting," Ivy said, arms wrapped around herself on the edge of the couch. "That's the opening line of every terrible thing anyone has ever said to me." A faint, tired smile touched his mouth. "Fair. I've had 200 years to practice speeches, and apparently none of them have improved with age." He folded his hands, considered the window for a moment, the dark street below where, less than a day earlier, he had nearly torn a man's throat out for touching her. In 1836, this city granted a parcel of land along what is now Verity Lane to a family of settlers, a modest allotment, nothing especially remarkable on paper. What the paper does not say, because the paper was never meant to survive long enough for anyone outside a very small circle to read it, is that the land was granted in exchange for a service. The family who received it were healers, not physicians in the formal sense the era recognized, though they were that too, but something older. They understood blood in ways the medical establishment of the time did not, could not, would have burned them for claiming to understand. Ivy sat very still, listening, the archived documents from that afternoon burning at the edges of her memory. The smudged signature she'd found under gloved fingers. "Callahan," she said quietly. "The name on the transfer deed." Something flickered across Julian's face. Surprise, she thought, quickly suppressed. "You've already found them." "I went to the county archive today. There's a fire damage deed with the name Callahan on the signature line. I don't know anyone in my family who ever lived in Savannah. My parents are from Ohio. I moved here for a job 6 years ago because it was the only firm that offered me a position out of school. I didn't choose this city for any reason connected to family history. I didn't know I had any." "You wouldn't have," Julian said. "Whatever memory your family carried of this place was deliberately, carefully erased, generations ago, for reasons that will make more sense once I've finished. The Callahans of 1836 were not simply healers who happened to live near my court's territory. They were bound to it, and to the vampire who ruled it at the time, by an accord neither side entered into entirely willingly, but which both sides, in the end, found necessary to survive. Bound how? Julian was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood that whatever he said next could not be unsaid. There is a sickness that runs in the oldest of our bloodlines, Ivy. A slow degradation, a kind of rot that sets in after centuries of unlife, when the body that was never meant to survive so long begins, very gradually, to fail. It does not look like human illness. It looks like madness at first, irritability, cruelty that was not there before. Eventually, if left untreated, it becomes something closer to a wasting, a creeping paralysis of the will and the body both. And it kills, in the end, more of my kind than any hunter or rival court ever has. We call it, in the old tongue, the hollowing, and the Callahans could cure it. Not cure, manage, slow. In 1836, the vampire who ruled this territory, an ancestor of mine by blood, though we do not typically produce offspring in the manner humans understand it, was deep into the hollowing, dying by inches in a city that did not yet know what lived beneath its cobblestones. Your ancestor, a woman named Margaret Callahan, discovered, through means the surviving records do not fully explain, a treatment. Something in the composition of her own blood passed to her children and her children's children that, when given regularly and carefully, arrested the hollowing entirely. In exchange for that service, rendered across the remainder of her life, and promised, through the accord, to her descendants after her, my ancestor granted the Callahan family land, protection, and a standing invitation into whatever prosperity the Coven's territory produced. It was, by the standards of that era and that world, an extraordinarily generous arrangement. It sounds, Ivy said, slowly, like you're describing a family that got signed up to be blood donors for 200 years and called it generous because they also got a house. Julian's mouth twitched, something that was almost approval. You have your ancestors' directness, at least. You are correct that the arrangement was not without its imbalance. I will not pretend otherwise to make it more palatable. But the accord was not slavery, Ivy. It was mutual. The Callahans who honored it were never drained, never harmed, never treated as cattle the way some of my kind treat the humans, unlucky enough to fall into their territory unprotected. They gave a measured, careful donation on an agreed schedule, and in return they received wealth, protection, and standing that no ordinary family in that century, in that city, could otherwise have hoped for. Whether that arrangement was fair is a question I have turned over more times than you can imagine in the 200 years since it was made. I do not have a comfortable answer for you. I only have the truth of what happened. So what happened to them? My family. If it was such a good deal, why don't I know anything about it? Why did I grow up in Ohio with no idea any of this existed? The question seemed to cost him something to answer. He was silent long enough that Ivy thought, for a moment, he might not answer at all. In 1911, he said finally, there was a fire. You found the record of it today, though the archive clerk likely told you only that it destroyed municipal paperwork. It destroyed considerably more than that. A rival court, one that had coveted this territory for decades and resented the protection my line extended to a human family it considered, in their words, a weakness unbecoming of a sovereign, engineered that fire deliberately. Their intention was to kill the last living Callahan of that generation, a young woman named Sarah, and in doing so, sever the accord and force my ancestor into the full grip of the hollowing, weak enough that the rival court could move against him and take this territory for themselves. Ivy felt something cold settle in her stomach. Did they succeed? Partially. Sarah Callahan survived the fire, but her mother did not. And in the chaos and grief that followed, my ancestor made a decision I have spent a century disagreeing with, though I understand, better now than I did as a much younger vampire, why he made it. He erased the accord from Sarah's memory entirely, along with every trace of her family's history in this city, and arranged, quietly, for her to be relocated far away, to a new name, a new life, protected, but severed from everything that had come before. He believed it was the only way to keep her safe from a rival court that would otherwise never stop hunting a bloodline capable of curing the hollowing. He believed erasing the knowledge entirely, salting the ground so thoroughly that no descendant would ever stumble back into this danger, was an act of mercy. And instead, Ivy said, quiet, furious, in a way she hadn't expected to feel about people who had died before her own grandparents were born. You just made sure that 100 years later, one of us would walk into all of this completely blind. No warning, no idea what we were signing up for. I read every clause of that lease, Julian, and there was nothing in it that told me what I actually was. No, he agreed. And for the first time since she'd met him, something in his composure looked genuinely, uncomplicatedly ashamed. There wasn't. That failure belongs to my court, and to me specifically, because by the time Verity Trust Partners began searching territory records for any trace of the surviving Callahan line, I was the one who authorized the search, and I am the one who instructed Marguerite to draft a lease that would bind you to the old accord's terms, without explaining, plainly, what those terms actually were. I told myself it was necessary caution, that revealing everything before you'd even signed a lease might frighten you away entirely into a life even more precarious than the one you already had. I have had 100 years to consider whether that reasoning was honest or merely convenient, and I no longer fully believe it was honest. So why tell me now? Why not just let the accord sit there, quiet, the way it apparently sat for 100 years before some algorithm or private investigator or whatever it was found my name in a property database? Because last night, a man laid his hands on you on a public street, and I discovered, in the moment I found you bleeding on that sidewalk, that I was no longer capable of treating this as a matter of territory and lineage and old debts owed to a dead ancestor. I discovered that the thought of losing you before I had even properly introduced myself made something in me that has been dormant for a very long time wake up in a way I did not expect and, frankly, did not entirely welcome. He said it without softness, without the practiced romance Ivy half expected from a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a Gothic oil painting. Said it instead like a confession extracted under duress. Honest, because the alternative, at this point, was cowardice. I am telling you the truth now because you deserve it, and because I no longer trust myself to keep hiding it and still call myself something other than the very thing my rivals accuse my line of being. Ivy sat with that for a long moment, the apartment quiet except for the hum of the old radiator finally, blessedly working in the hallway outside her door. "What happens now?" she asked. "Practically, if I decided I wanted nothing to do with any of this, the accord, the blood, whatever obligation you think I inherited from a woman who's been dead for a century, could I just leave, move to another city, break the lease, disappear the way Sarah Callahan disappeared?" "You could try," Julian said, and something in the careful precision of his phrasing told Ivy that the honest answer was more complicated than a simple yes. "I would not stop you, and I would ensure, personally, that no harm came to you in the attempt. But I will not lie to you and pretend the danger ends the moment you leave Savannah. The rival court that started the 1911 fire did not vanish. It has been quiet, patient, biding its time, in the way my kind is uniquely suited to biding time, but it has never stopped watching this territory for weakness. And the discovery that a living Callahan has resurfaced, capable of treating the hollowing that has begun, very slowly, to take hold in me, as it once took hold in my ancestor, is not information that will remain contained to my court alone. If they learn what you are and what you can do before you have any protection or understanding of the world you were born into, you will be considerably more vulnerable somewhere else, alone and ignorant, than you would be here, difficult as that is for me to say aloud without it sounding like a threat." "Is it the hollowing?" Ivy asked slowly, piecing it together. "That's actually why you bought this building. Not because you wanted a real estate investment, because your intelligence network found a Callahan descendant, and you needed her." "That was the beginning of it, yes," Julian said, and had the grace, at least, to not pretend otherwise. "I will not insult you by claiming I acquired this property purely out of romantic destiny. I acquired it because I am dying, slowly, the way my ancestor was dying, in 1836, and because the records, incomplete as they were, indicated that the last known Callahan descendant currently resided in Unit 2 of a building I could purchase quietly without drawing attention through a shell company old enough that no one would question its motives. That was the plan. Cold and pragmatic, exactly as it sounds. And now?" He looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded moving behind his eyes that Ivy had not seen in him before, not in the lobby, not on the street, not even in the raw honesty of the last several minutes. "Now, I find that the prospect of you as merely a medical necessity is one I can no longer hold in my mind without a considerable amount of self-disgust. You are not a treatment to me anymore, Ivy, if you ever fully were. I am not certain what that makes this, whatever this is between us. But I did not come here tonight only to explain an accord. I came because I find, disconcertingly, that I wanted to see you safe with my own eyes, and that wanting was considerably larger than the practical reasons I had originally constructed for finding you at all." Ivy did not know what to say to that, and so, for a while, she said nothing, and Julian did not fill the silence either, seeming to understand, with the patience of someone who had learned to wait out centuries that this was not a moment that could be rushed toward resolution. It was the sound of a car passing outside, headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling, that finally broke the stillness. "I need time," Ivy said, "to think, to figure out what any of this actually means for my life. Practically, not just historically. I have a job. I have rent to pay whether or not I'm secretly some kind of vampire medicine. I can't just absorb 200 years of family history in one night and know what to do with it." "That's fair," Julian said, rising from the chair with the same unhurried grace he did everything with. "Take whatever time you need. I will not push you toward any particular decision, and I will not enter your home again without your invitation. Tonight or any other night, unless you are in danger and cannot issue one yourself. That much, at least, I can promise you plainly." He was almost to the door when Ivy spoke again, the question surfacing before she'd fully decided to ask it. "The clause in the lease, about the tenancy being transferable by residents, not just by blood. What did that mean exactly? Was that just about me? Or is there something else in this building I should be worried about?" Something in Julian's expression shifted, and for the first time that night, Ivy saw genuine wariness cross his face, quick and gone, but unmistakable. "There is a member of my court," he said carefully, "who has never fully accepted my decision to bring the old accord back into effect, and who has made her displeasure known, in her own way, since the day the sale went through. Her name is Odette Castellane, and I would ask that you avoid her, if you encounter her, until I have had the chance to make our arrangement, whatever it becomes, considerably more formal and considerably harder for her to challenge." "Challenge how?" "Odette believes," Julian said, choosing his words with visible care, "that a sovereign weakened enough to require a human cure is a sovereign no longer fit to hold his territory. She has said as much, more than once, in council. She has not yet acted on that belief, because to do so, without cause, would violate the old codes governing challenges to a sitting sovereign. But a new human tenant, bound to an ancient accord, she considers an embarrassment, arriving in the middle of my hollowing, is precisely the kind of cause she has been waiting for. I do not say this to frighten you further tonight. I say it because I would rather you hear my enemies' names from me than discover them, unprepared, on a dark street, the way you discovered Gerald Pruitt's true nature last night." The name settled into Ivy's memory with a cold, unpleasant weight. One more thing to carry alongside the archived documents and the crimson eyes and the sensation, growing now by the hour, that the quiet, ordinary life she had been living in this building for 3.5 weeks had been, from the very beginning, considerably less quiet and considerably less ordinary than she had allowed herself to believe. "Get some rest, Ivy," Julian said, at the door now, one hand on the frame. "Tomorrow, if you're willing, I would like to show you something. Not tell you, show you. There is a part of this history that is easier understood than explained, and I think you deserve to see it before you decide anything further about what you want your life, going forward, to look like." She agreed, mostly because she didn't yet have the strength to refuse, and he left the way he arrived, quietly, without the unnatural silence of the street the night before. A small, deliberate courtesy she recognized, now, as exactly that. She did not sleep that night either, but the fear that kept her awake had changed shape somewhat, no longer the simple animal terror of a predator in her hallway, but something more complicated, tangled through with grief for a great-great-grandmother she had never known existed. Anger at a decision made a century before her birth that had left her walking blind into all of it, and underneath everything else, quiet and unwelcome and impossible to fully suppress, a curiosity about the man who had told her, plainly, that he no longer wanted to think of her as merely a cure. The following evening, true to his word, Julian arrived not at midnight, but just after sunset, dressed more simply than she'd yet seen him, a dark sweater rather than the tailored coat, and led her, on foot, through streets Ivy had walked 100 times without ever noticing the particular door tucked into an alley off Chippewa Square. Unmarked, easy to miss, unless you already knew it was there. Behind it, down a narrow flight of stone steps that felt older than anything else in a city built almost entirely on old things, was a room Ivy would spend a long time afterward trying to describe to herself in language that made any sense at all. It looked, at first glance, like an archive, shelves upon shelves of documents, portraits in heavy frames, a genealogical record stretching back further than any single family line had any right to stretch. But as her eyes adjusted to the low lamplight, Ivy understood it was something more specific than a general archive. It was a record of the Accord itself. Generation after generation of Callahans catalogued in careful, reverent detail, their portraits commissioned and preserved long after their descendants had forgotten they existed, their contributions to the Coven's survival documented with a thoroughness that read uncomfortably like devotion. "This is every one of them," Julian said quietly, standing beside her as she moved slowly along the wall of portraits. Margaret Callahan's stern, unsmiling face rendered in oil paint at the very start of the row, her descendants following in a line that traced almost, but not quite, all the way to the present day, ending abruptly with a portrait of a young woman Ivy recognized, with a jolt that stole the breath from her lungs as unmistakably, uncannily herself. "How?" Ivy started, and could not finish the sentence, staring at a painting of her own face, rendered in a style at least a century out of date, the artist's hand somehow catching an expression she recognized from her own mirror. "That is not you," Julian said gently. "That is Sarah Callahan, painted in 1910, the year before the fire. I do not know whether it is coincidence or something deeper in the blood that repeats itself across generations, but I confess, the resemblance was the first thing that told me, with any certainty, that our search had found the right descendant." Ivy stood in front of the portrait for a long time, looking at a face that was and was not her own, feeling the full, dizzying weight of everything Julian had told her the night before settle, finally, into something that felt real rather than simply frightening, a family history stretching back further than she had ever imagined, waiting quietly in the dark for nearly a century for someone to walk back into it. She did not yet know, standing in that hidden room beneath Chippewa Square, that Odette Castellane had already learned of her existence, or that the woman was, at that very moment, less than 3 blocks away, watching the alley entrance with the patient, contemptuous attention of someone already calculating exactly how she intended to use this new, inconvenient human against the sovereign she had spent decades waiting to see fall. Odette Castellane had been waiting a very long time for a mistake, and when word reached her, through a maintenance worker, she had quietly compromised months before the sale of 114 Verity Lane ever closed, that Julian Voss had personally escorted a human woman into the sealed archive beneath Chippewa Square. She understood, with the cold satisfaction of a predator finally seeing an opening in a fence line it had circled for years, that the mistake she had been waiting for had finally arrived. She was old, older than Julian by nearly a century, though she wore that age the way certain vampires learned to wear it, as a kind of permanent, glacial youth rather than the visible decay that came for lesser bloodlines. She had pale gold hair she kept in a severe twist, a wardrobe of black and ivory tailored with a precision that made every human designer she'd ever employed weep with gratitude for the commission, and a face so symmetrically, coldly beautiful that Ivy, when she finally saw her 3 days later, would think of a mask before she thought of a woman. Odette did not confront Julian directly. She was too patient, too practiced in the long game of coven politics, to waste an advantage on a hasty accusation that could be denied and explained away in council. Instead, she went first to Ivy. On an afternoon when Julian was occupied elsewhere in the city attending to matters of territory, he could not, even now, fully set aside, and she did it in the one place she knew Ivy could not easily avoid her. The small courtyard behind 114 Verity Lane, where Ivy had taken to sitting some mornings before her shift with a cup of coffee and the last quiet minutes of her day before the world required anything more of her. "You must be the tenant everyone has suddenly become so interested in," Odette said, appearing at the courtyard's iron gate without the courtesy of an announcement, her voice cool and cultured, and carrying an old-world precision that made Julian's accent, by comparison, sound almost casual. "Ivy Callahan, I confess I expected someone more remarkable." Ivy set her coffee down carefully, recognizing, from the particular chill that had entered the courtyard air the moment the gate creaked open, exactly who this was before the woman ever offered a name. "You're Odette. You've been told about me then. How flattering that I merit a warning." Odette moved into the courtyard with unhurried steps, the morning sun, weak as it was through Savannah's perpetual cloud cover, seeming to slide off her pale skin without quite touching it. "I imagine Julian painted me as some manner of villain, the ambitious rival, jealous of his throne, unable to accept that a human girl has wandered into our world and upended 2 centuries of careful order. Is that the story? He told me you don't think he should be sovereign anymore because he's sick," Ivy said, choosing honesty over diplomacy, mostly because she had already decided, somewhere in the sleepless hours of the last 3 nights, that she was done being managed and handled by people who assumed her ignorance made her easy to maneuver, and that you're looking for an excuse to challenge him. Something flickered behind Odette's pale eyes, surprise, perhaps, that the human girl had not bothered with false politeness. How refreshingly direct. "Very well, then. Let us speak directly. Julian Voss is dying. Miss Callahan, slowly, the way his predecessor died in this very city nearly 200 years ago, and the only reason the coven has not already moved to replace him is a fragile, sentimental hope among the older families that history might repeat itself kindly rather than cruelly. That hope has a name now, you, and I would be a poor steward of my own bloodline's interests if I did not, at minimum, come and look the hope in the eye." "I'm not a cure," Ivy said. "I'm a person, and I didn't ask for any of this." "No," Odette agreed, with a thin, humorless smile. "Neither did Margaret Callahan, I imagine, in 1836. And yet here we are, nearly 2 centuries later, still discussing whether a human woman's blood is sufficient to prop up a failing sovereign, as though nothing at all has changed in the intervening years. I find that, honestly, more troubling than anything else in this entire arrangement. Not that Julian needs saving, that the mechanism of his saving is apparently identical to the one his ancestor used, down to the very bloodline required to provide it. Ivy hadn't considered it from quite that angle before, and something in Odette's framing, cold and self-serving, as it clearly was, snagged uncomfortably at a thought Ivy had already been circling on her own since the night in the archive room. What do you actually want, Odette? Because it doesn't sound like you're here out of concern for me. I want, Odette said, stepping closer, close enough now that Ivy could feel the particular, unnatural cold radiating off her skin. What I have wanted for the better part of 80 years, which is a sovereign strong enough to hold this territory without requiring an emergency transfusion from a human archivist every time his condition worsens. I do not particularly care whether that sovereign is Julian, restored to full strength through means that do not leave him beholden to a bloodline he must protect at the expense of the Coven's other priorities, or whether it is someone else entirely, should he prove permanently unfit. What I will not accept, Miss Callahan, is watching this territory drift for another decade while an ailing king clings to power through a human crutch, because the codes of succession in this court are not kind to sovereigns who cannot demonstrate plainly and regularly that they remain fit to rule. So you're threatening him. Through me, I am informing you, Odette said, of the reality you have wandered into, so that you do not make the mistake of believing this is a simple romance between a lonely king and the girl who happened to move into his building. There are decades of politics bound up in what you represent, and if you intend to remain here, bound to this accord, you would do well to understand that Julian is not the only interested party watching to see what you do next. She left as abruptly as she'd arrived, the gate creaking shut behind her, the courtyard's temperature crawling slowly back toward its ordinary morning warmth, and Ivy sat alone with her cooling coffee for a long time afterward, turning the conversation over with the same careful attention she gave to a suspicious contract clause, trying to determine which parts of it had been manipulation and which parts, however unwelcome, had been true. She did not go to work that day. She called in, claimed a migraine, and instead sat at her small kitchen table with a legal pad she had bought years ago for a different purpose, entirely, and began, methodically, the way she had been trained to approach any document whose author might be hiding something in the language, to write down everything Odette had said, word for word, as best she could recall it, looking for the places where the woman's logic bent slightly out of true. The pattern that emerged, the longer Ivy stared at her own handwriting, was that Odette had never once said Julian was unfit now. She had said only that he had been unfit, that a challenge could be justified on the history of his decline rather than its present trajectory, and that the codes governing succession, old and rigid as they were, might not distinguish cleanly between a sovereign who had been failing and a sovereign who was actively, verifiably recovering. It was, Ivy realized, the exact same trick she saw humans attempt in contract disputes at the law firm nearly every week. An argument built not on present fact, but on a snapshot of the past, presented as though nothing since that snapshot had changed. It was a manipulation of timing, not of truth. And manipulations of timing, Ivy had learned across 6 years of proofreading, were almost always vulnerable to a sufficiently careful reading of whatever document had originally established the rules. She went to the archive that evening with a new purpose entirely, no longer simply curious about her family's history, but hunting, specifically for anything in the original 1836 Accord, or its surviving amendments that addressed the timing of a fitness challenge, the conditions under which a sovereign's condition could or could not be used against him, and whether the accord itself, negotiated by a woman shrewd enough to secure land and protection for her descendants in an era when women rarely secured anything through negotiation alone, might have anticipated exactly this kind of maneuver. Julian found her there past midnight, papers spread in careful, methodical piles across the archive's long table. And when she explained what she was looking for, something crossed his face that Ivy was beginning to recognize as a particular, quiet species of wonder. The look of a man who had spent 2 centuries assuming certain battles could only ever be fought with violence, discovering, slowly, that some of them could be fought with patience and careful reading instead. "You believe there's a defense buried in the accord itself," he said. "Something Margaret negotiated that neither of us has ever needed to invoke." "I think," Ivy said, not looking up from the page in front of her, "that a woman smart enough to negotiate an entire land grant and a 2-century protection arrangement in 1836, when she had essentially no legal standing to negotiate anything at all, was not the kind of person who would leave the one clause protecting her own descendants' position in this court to chance. I think if there's a defense in here, she put it there on purpose. And I think it's been sitting unused for 200 years, because nobody since her has needed it, or nobody since her has read carefully enough to find it." It took another 4 days of careful, exhausting work, cross-referencing Margaret's private notes against the formal accord language and against a set of coven procedural records Julian retrieved, reluctantly, from a locked section of the archive he admitted he had not opened in decades, before Ivy found the clause she'd been looking for, tucked into an appendix so dense with archaic legal phrasing that she had read past it twice before the meaning finally surfaced. It granted, precisely as Ivy would later state aloud in the street before Odette and dozens of assembled witnesses, standing to the treating Callahan in any matter concerning the sovereign's fitness, specifically to prevent, the appendix stated in language Margaret herself had almost certainly dictated, any future faction from exploiting a period of illness during active treatment to seize power through violence rather than patience. She was protecting whoever came after her, Ivy said quietly, staring at the page. Not just herself. She knew this exact situation might happen again someday. Someone using the sickness against the sovereign she was treating, and she built in a defense 200 years before anyone would need it. "She could not have known it would be you," Julian said, reading her words 2 centuries later, in the exact circumstance she seems to have anticipated. "No," Ivy agreed. "But she knew someone would need it eventually. That's the whole point of writing something down carefully. Instead of just trusting people to be reasonable, you write it down for the person who isn't in the room yet, the one who's going to need the protection long after you're gone." That discovery, more than the confrontation in the street that followed it days later, was the moment Ivy would return to, in the months and years that came after, as the true turning point of everything, not because it involved violence or danger, but because it was the moment she stopped thinking of herself as someone caught inside a 200-year-old family obligation and started thinking of herself as someone continuing a 200-year-old family's work, deliberately, with her eyes open, in a way that felt entirely different from simply inheriting a debt. The 2 weeks that followed the courtyard confrontation and preceded Odette's attack on the street were not, Ivy would admit later, purely devoted to research and treatment. There were quieter moments too, ordinary in a way that felt strange set against everything else unfolding around them. Evenings spent in the archive that drifted, without either of them quite planning it, into conversations that had nothing to do with accords or hollowing or coven politics at all. Julian describing cities that no longer existed in the form he remembered them, the particular sound Savannah's harbor had made in an era before engines, the taste of foods that had vanished from human memory along with the centuries that produced them. Ivy found herself telling him, in turn, about a childhood in Ohio that felt impossibly small and ordinary next to everything he described, about the particular loneliness of moving to a new city for a job, and spending 6 years building a life that never quite felt permanent, about the strange, guilty relief of finally understanding, after weeks of archive research, exactly why nothing in Savannah had ever felt entirely random. There was an evening, roughly 10 days after the courtyard confrontation, when Julian brought her, without warning or explanation, to a modest, unremarkable house on the edge of the historic district, its windows dark, its garden overgrown in the particular way that spoke of long neglect rather than recent abandonment. He told her, standing at the gate, that it had been Margaret Callahan's home, purchased with the very land grant the 1,836 accord had provided, passed through the family for 3 generations before the 1911 fire scattered Sarah Callahan into an anonymous new life and left the house, eventually sold off to strangers who never knew what it had once been. "I bought it back," Julian admitted, "several years ago, before I had any confirmation a living Callahan still existed. I told myself it was simply prudent, securing a piece of the coven's history before it could fall into careless hands. I understand now that some part of me was already hoping, long before I had any evidence to justify the hope, that someone would eventually come to stand in front of it who had a right to." Ivy stood at the gate for a long time, looking at a house that had belonged to a great-great-great-grandmother she had never known existed until weeks earlier, feeling something complicated settle into her chest. Grief for a life she had never been told about, and underneath the grief, something steadier, the sense of a foundation finally being laid under a life that had, for 6 years, felt like it was built on nothing at all. "I'd like to see inside," she said, and Julian, wordless, opened the gate. They did not speak much, moving through rooms thick with dust and the particular stillness of a house that had sat empty far too long. But near the end of the walk-through, in what had once clearly been a study, Ivy found, tucked into a built-in bookshelf that had somehow survived a century of neglect and at least 2 changes of ownership, a small, cracked leather journal with the initials M.C. stamped faintly into its cover. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it, and Julian, watching her face, rather than the journal itself, did not press her to explain what she found there. Understanding, in the particular way he had learned to understand her over these strange, compressed weeks, that some discoveries needed to be absorbed in silence before they could be shared aloud. What Ivy found, in Margaret's own hand, in ink faded nearly to invisibility in places, was not medical notes this time, but something closer to a letter, addressed to no one in particular, or perhaps, Ivy thought, addressed to exactly the person who would eventually find it. Margaret had written, in careful, deliberate script, that she did not regret the accord she had made, whatever cost it had asked of her, because it had given her family safety in a world that offered women and their children very little safety otherwise, but that she hoped, if any descendant of hers ever found themselves standing where she had once stood, they would remember that the accord was a beginning and not a cage, that whatever bound them to this strange, dark world could be reshaped over time into something chosen rather than merely endured, if only they were patient enough and clever enough to insist on it. Ivy read the passage twice, then a third time, and found, when she finally looked up, that Julian was watching her with an expression she had no easy name for, something between reverence and grief. She knew, Ivy said quietly. Somehow, even then, she knew. Someone would need to hear this eventually. I think, Julian said, that is simply what it means to build something carefully. For people you will never meet, you write down not just the rules, but the reasons behind them, in the hope that whoever inherits the rules someday will also inherit enough of the reasoning to know when the rules need to bend. They left the house that evening with the journal carefully wrapped and carried, and Ivy would return to it many times in the months that followed, rereading Margaret's careful, patient hope that whatever bound her descendants to this world could someday become something chosen, a hope that Ivy, standing in a quiet street some weeks later, refusing to let Odette Castellane simply take Julian's life through violence and old law, would finally, fully, help to realize. Watching his jaw tighten with a fury he visibly worked to control as she relayed it. And when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. She is not wrong about the codes, he admitted, low, reluctant. A sovereign who cannot demonstrate fitness to rule can be challenged formally before the full council. And if the challenge succeeds, the outcome is rarely gentle. I had hoped to manage my condition quietly enough, for long enough, that the question would never need to be raised. Odette clearly no longer intends to allow me that quiet. What happens if she challenges you? Formally, I mean. What does that actually look like? A combat, Julian said simply. Ritualized, ancient, and absolute. Whichever of us survives holds the territory. It is not something either side walks away from having merely lost a debate. Ivy felt something cold settle in her chest at the plainness of that answer. The casual way he described what amounted, in practice, to a fight to the death, as though it were an unremarkable feature of the world he'd lived in for 2 centuries rather than the horror it plainly was to her. And you're not strong enough for that. Not yet, not with the hollowing. No, he admitted. Not yet. Then we need to figure out how to actually treat this properly, Ivy said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. Not just slow it down with whatever the accord originally described, but actually cure it, if that's even possible, before Odette decides she's tired of waiting. Julian looked at her for a long moment, something in his expression that Ivy was beginning to recognize as the particular, careful way he looked at things he had stopped allowing himself to hope for. You would do that, knowing everything Odette told you this morning, knowing the history of what this accord has asked of your family. I'd do it because you're dying and I apparently have the one thing that can help, and because I've spent 6 years proofreading contracts for people who treat each other like garbage over property lines, and I am extremely tired of watching people get hurt because nobody was willing to actually fix the underlying problem instead of managing around it, Ivy said, and heard, in her own voice, an echo of the stubbornness that had gotten her through 6 years in a decaying apartment with a landlord who never fixed anything. So yes, let's actually fix this properly, not just enough to keep you alive for another political fight with Odette next year. It took the better part of 2 weeks to determine, through careful, methodical research conducted jointly between Ivy's contract-trained eye for detail and the resources of Julian's hidden archive, that the original 1,836 accord had never actually specified a full cure at all, only a management protocol, a repeated, measured donation intended to hold the hollowing at bay indefinitely rather than reverse it. Because Margaret Callahan, brilliant as she had been, had never actually understood the deeper chemistry of what her blood was doing, only that it worked, and that understanding the mechanism fully had simply never been necessary to keep her sovereign alive. Ivy, reading through Margaret's own preserved notes, dense, cramped 19th-century handwriting describing symptoms and treatments and dosages with a precision that read uncomfortably like a medical journal written by someone with no formal medical training whatsoever, began to notice something the notes themselves never directly stated, but which the pattern, once she saw it, made almost obvious. Margaret's treatments had worked best, had produced the longest periods of remission, on the occasions when the donation was given not out of obligation, but during moments of what her careful, clinical prose described only as heightened emotional resonance between herself and the sovereign she treated. The blood, in other words, appeared to carry some component that intensified, strengthened, transformed in proportion to the depth of the bond between the giver and the recipient, a detail Margaret herself had apparently noticed without ever fully articulating it, buried in careful asides about certain treatments proving more effective than others without any explanation for why. It's not just the blood, Ivy said, 3 days into poring over the notes, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the archive room with pages spread out around her, Julian across from her with an expression of careful, dawning attention. It's the blood plus something else, some kind of bond. Look, here, and here again, 3 separate times, she notes the treatment working faster and lasting longer during periods she describes as, and I'm reading this directly, a season of particular closeness between myself and my Lord. That's not medical language. That's emotional language. And she wrote it into a treatment log, which means she noticed a pattern significant enough to record, even though she never had the framework to explain it. Julian took the page from her carefully, reading Margaret's cramped hand himself, and something in his face shifted slowly from academic interest into something considerably raw. If that's true, he said quietly, then the accord was never actually a transaction at all. Not really. It only ever worked fully when it stopped being one, which means, Ivy said, feeling the weight of the realization settle over both of them at once, the reason it's been managed instead of cured for 200 years isn't that a cure was impossible. It's that nobody in your family history ever let it become anything other than an obligation. They kept it transactional on purpose, because the alternative was actually caring about the person you were bound to, and that terrified everyone involved a lot more than just staying sick did. Julian set the page down with a hand that was, Ivy noticed, not entirely steady. "I think," he said, "you may have just diagnosed my entire bloodline's 2-century failure of nerve, Miss Callahan, in roughly 4 sentences. I read contracts for a living," Ivy said. "People hide their real intentions in the fine print because admitting them plainly is scarier than any legal consequence. Turns out that's true whether you're mortal or not." It should have felt, in that moment, like the resolution of the mystery. The clean, satisfying reveal that every problem in the story had built toward, and for a few days, it almost did. Julian's condition, once Ivy began, deliberately and without the careful, clinical distance either of them had maintained at the outset, treating their bond as something real rather than something managed, began to show the first genuine signs of reversal. Margaret's own notes had only ever hinted were possible. The grey pallor that had settled, subtly, beneath Julian's skin over the preceding months began to recede. The tremor Ivy had noticed once or twice in his hands, so slight she'd initially dismissed it, as her own imagination steadied and vanished entirely. He looked, within a week, less like a man managing a slow decline, and more like what Ivy imagined he must have looked like at the true height of his power, centuries ago, before the hollowing had ever begun its quiet work. Odette noticed too. Of course, she noticed. And the speed of Julian's recovery, rather than reassuring her, seemed only to accelerate whatever plan she had already set in motion the moment she'd left Ivy alone in that courtyard. The attack came on a night Ivy would spend a long time afterward trying to reconstruct in careful order, because in the moment itself, everything happened too fast and too violently for her mind to hold on to more than fragments. She had closed the coffee shop again, a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way until the walk home, when the temperature on the quiet street outside, 114 Verity Lane, dropped with the same sudden, unnatural totality she remembered from the night Julian had saved her from Gerald Pruitt. Except this time the cold did not announce Julian's arrival. It announced someone else's. 3 figures emerged from the shadows between the streetlights, moving with the same inhuman, gliding speed Ivy now recognized as belonging to Julian's kind, and, at their center, unmistakable even in the dark, Odette Castellane, dressed for violence rather than diplomacy this time, in fitted black that left no doubt about her intentions. "I did warn you," Odette said, drawing close, with unhurried confidence, "that there were interested parties, beyond Julian, watching to see what you would do. I had hoped you might simply grow bored of the arrangement and leave on your own. Instead, you appear to be curing him rather more thoroughly than the original accord ever managed, which I confess presents me with a more urgent problem than I had originally anticipated." "You're going to hurt me to stop him from getting better," Ivy said, backing toward the building's front door, keys already threaded between her fingers, though some distant, rational part of her understood how little that particular precaution would matter against what stood in front of her now. "I am going to remove the variable entirely," Odette said, "before a fully restored sovereign becomes considerably harder for me to challenge successfully. I take no particular pleasure in this, Miss Callahan. I simply understand, better than Julian apparently does, that sentiment is a luxury this world rarely allows those of us who intend to survive in it." The 2 figures flanking her moved, before Ivy had finished processing the sentence, and she had time only to scream. Once, sharp and useless in the empty street, before a cold hand closed around her arm hard enough to bruise, yanking her off her feet. Julian arrived the way he always arrived. Without warning, without the courtesy of sound, simply present in the space between one heartbeat and the next, and the violence that followed was unlike anything Ivy had witnessed, even on the night he'd nearly torn Gerald Pruitt's throat out. He moved through Odette's two enforcers with a speed and a fury that left both of them broken and unmoving on the pavement within seconds, bones audibly shattering under blows too fast for Ivy's eyes to properly track. And when he turned, finally, to face Odette herself, his eyes had gone entirely, terrifyingly crimson. The grey pallor of his illness, replaced now by something that radiated raw, restored power, in a way Ivy had not yet seen from him. "You laid your hands on her?" Julian said, and his voice carried none of the controlled civility Ivy had come to associate with him, stripped down instead to something ancient and absolute. "A second time, Odette. I was, perhaps, willing to overlook the first insult as the posturing of a rival testing a wound. I am considerably less willing to overlook this one. Then let us finish what I came here to start," Odette said. And there was no fear in her voice, only the cold, ready calculation of someone who had spent decades preparing for exactly this confrontation. "A formal challenge, Julian. Here, now, before witnesses enough to make it binding." She gestured, and Ivy realized with a fresh jolt of terror that the street was not as empty as it had appeared. Shapes emerging from doorways and rooftops, coven members drawn by whatever silent summons had called them here. Dozens of pale, watching faces arranged in a loose circle around the confrontation. An audience assembled for exactly the outcome Odette had planned all along. "No?" Ivy said, stepping forward before she'd fully decided to, before fear had a chance to override the sheer, stubborn refusal rising in her chest. "You don't get to do this. Not over me. Not like this. This is not your fight to end, Miss Callahan," Odette said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "This is the oldest law my kind possesses. A sovereign's fitness may be challenged, and the challenge, once formally issued before witnesses, must be answered. Julian knows this as well as I do. Then I'm issuing a counter," Ivy said, the words coming to her from some deep, half-remembered corner of the archive notes she'd spent 2 weeks poring over. Margaret Callahan's cramped handwriting describing not just the treatment protocol, but, buried in an appendix Ivy had read only once and nearly dismissed, the original terms of the accord itself, terms that had apparently never been invoked in 200 years because no descendant since Margaret had ever understood they existed. "The accord grants the Callahan line standing in matters concerning the sovereign's fitness, doesn't it?" I read it. Margaret negotiated that clause herself in 1836, specifically, so no future coven faction could challenge a sovereign she was actively treating without the treating Callahan's testimony being considered. "I'm invoking that." A ripple of surprise moved through the assembled coven members, murmurs passing between shapes in the dark, and Odette's composed expression cracked, for the first time, into something like genuine alarm. "That clause has not been invoked in 2 centuries. You cannot possibly. I read every page of my own family's history in your archive for 2 weeks, Ivy said. "Because, apparently, that's what you do when you find out your ancestors have been keeping a 200-year-old secret from you." I know what I'm invoking, and what it means is that you don't get to challenge Julian's fitness, while the treating Calosan states, formally, before these same witnesses, that his condition has been actively, verifiably reversing for the past 2 weeks. That's not a sovereign who's failing, Odette. That's a sovereign who's recovering. And the codes you're so fond of quoting apparently require you to wait and see the outcome of that recovery before you're allowed to challenge anything. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Ivy could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears. And then, from somewhere in the assembled circle, an older voice, cracked with age even by vampire standards, spoke into the quiet. The girl is correct. The Accord's fitness clause has not been repealed. It stands. Odette's composure did not shatter. Exactly. But something in her rigid posture loosened, just slightly. The calculation behind her eyes visibly recalibrating in real time. "Then I withdraw the challenge," she said finally. Each word clipped, furious, controlled. "For now. But do not mistake this for surrender, Julian. If your recovery falters, if this human proves less permanent a solution than she currently appears, I will return, and I will not offer you the courtesy of a public challenge next time." She turned and vanished into the dark, with her 2 broken enforcers, the assembled coven members dispersing more slowly, murmuring among themselves in a way that told Ivy, without her needing to understand every word, that whatever had just happened on this street would be discussed and reshaped into legend long after tonight. Julian turned to her once the street had emptied, the crimson slowly bleeding out of his eyes, and for a long moment he simply looked at her with an expression Ivy had no easy name for, something between disbelief and a gratitude so raw it looked almost like pain. "You just stopped a formal challenge," he said, "using a clause you found in a 200-year-old appendix. In the middle of the street, while 3 people who intended to kill you were still standing in front of you. I told you," Ivy said, her hands only now beginning to shake with the delayed adrenaline of the last several minutes. "I read contracts for a living. Turns out the fine print is useful, even when the contract is 200 years old and half the parties involved are dead." Something in his face broke open then. The careful, controlled composure he had maintained through every previous conversation finally giving way to something unguarded, and he crossed the space between them and pulled her against his chest, cold and solid and steady. And Ivy let herself lean into it, exhausted, shaking, alive. "I have spent 2 centuries," Julian said quietly into her hair, "believing that the Accord was the only thing that could ever connect a Callahan to this court. An obligation passed down like a debt neither side ever fully wanted. I did not expect, in all that time, to find someone who would stand in the middle of a street facing down a rival sovereign and choose entirely of her own will to fight for me, instead of simply invoking the letter of an old law to save herself. I didn't do it just to save myself," Ivy said, muffled against his coat. "I did it because you're worth saving, and because I've decided, somewhere in the last 2 weeks, that I actually want this. Not the Accord, not the obligation. This. You. Whatever that means for the rest of my very complicated life now." The weeks that followed were not without their difficulties. Odette did not vanish entirely from the story. And there would be, in the months to come, further tension between the 2 vampire factions, careful negotiations, old grudges that did not dissolve simply because one confrontation had gone Julian's way. She returned twice more that autumn, once to formally lodge a procedural complaint before the full council, arguing that the fitness clause Ivy had invoked had never been intended to apply to an active romantic bond, and demanding the council rule the clause void on those grounds. And once, quieter and more dangerous, to attempt a private conversation with Ivy alone in the coffee shop, where she still, stubbornly, kept her shifts, one final effort to convince the human woman that whatever she felt for Julian was gratitude dressed up as love, a survivor's attachment to her rescuer rather than anything real. Ivy had listened to that second attempt all the way through, wiping down the espresso machine while Odette sat, uninvited, at the counter in the emptying shop, and had answered, finally, with the same plainness she'd learned to bring to every conversation with the woman. "I've thought about that," Ivy admitted. "Whether what I feel is real or just relief that someone powerful showed up and saved me from a bad situation. I thought about it a lot, actually, especially in the first few weeks, because it would have been an easy thing to believe and an easy thing to walk away from once I'd figured it out. But gratitude doesn't survive 2 weeks of reading 400-page archives at midnight because you actually want to understand someone's history. Gratitude doesn't make you stand in the middle of a street facing down someone who could kill you in half a second, if all you actually feel is relief that a rescue happened once. I've had time to sit with it, Odette. More time than you probably think I've had. And it isn't gratitude anymore. Maybe it started that way. It doesn't matter what it started as." Odette had left without argument that day, something in her cold composure finally, visibly shaken, and though she did not abandon her opposition to Julian's rule entirely, the formal challenge she had once seemed so certain to bring never fully materialized again. The council's ruling on the fitness clause eventually settling. After weeks of careful argument, Ivy herself was invited to help construct, in Julian's favor, on the grounds that a bond entered into freely, documented across weeks of demonstrable, active recovery, satisfied every historical intention behind the clause Margaret had written 2 centuries before. But the immediate danger passed, and with it, something settled into place between Julian and Ivy that neither the original 1836 accord nor Margarethy's carefully worded lease had ever quite managed to describe. Ivy kept her apartment on the 2nd floor for a while because she was not the kind of person who abandoned an entire life overnight simply because it had turned out to be stranger and larger than she'd ever imagined. And she kept her job at the law firm too, proofreading contracts by day, with a new, private amusement at how often ordinary human clients hid their real intentions in fine print nobody bothered to read closely. But she spent more and more evenings in the hidden rooms beneath Chippewa Square, continuing the careful work of understanding exactly what Margaret Callahan had discovered nearly 2 centuries before her, not because an accord demanded it, but because she had chosen, deliberately, to keep choosing it every evening in a way none of her ancestors, bound by obligation rather than will, had ever quite been free to do. Gerald Pruitt was never seen in Savannah again, true to whatever Julian had murmured into his ear on that dark street weeks before. And the building at 114 Verity Lane settled, slowly, into a version of itself that Mrs. Okafor and the young couple upstairs and every other tenant who had signed the new lease came to think of, without ever fully understanding why, as the safest, best-maintained building any of them had ever lived in. On a night some months later, standing on the balcony of the master suite Julian kept in a quieter, older part of the city, the two of them looking out over rooftops silvered by a low moon, Julian took her hand, his skin still cool but no longer carrying the frailty of a man losing a slow, silent war with his own body, and asked her, plainly, without the flourish either of them might once have expected from a scene like this, whether she intended to stay. "I already told you I wanted this," Ivy said. "The whole complicated mess of it. I'm not going anywhere, Julian. Not as an obligation," he said. "Not because a lease bound you to it, or because an ancestor 2 centuries dead negotiated terms on your behalf before you were ever born. I am asking you plainly, as myself, whether you choose this." "I choose it," Ivy said, and meant it entirely, in a way that had nothing left in it of fear or obligation or fine print, only the quiet, deliberate certainty of a woman who had read every clause of her own strange new life and signed it anyway. This time, with her eyes fully open. She had come to this city for a job, and to this building because an eviction notice had given her 9 days to find somewhere else to live, and she had signed a lease. She never fully understood, because she was tired and scared, and the rent was cheaper than what she'd been paying before. She had not known. Standing on that stoop with the county courthouse bell ringing 2 blocks away, that she was walking into 200 years of history, into an accord her own blood had negotiated before she was born, into a danger that very nearly cost her everything, on a quiet, ordinary street. She had not known any of it, but she knew it now, and she had chosen it anyway, and that choosing, in the end, was the one thing no ancient accord, no rival vampire, no careless landlord, and no fine print buried on page 14 of a lease had ever been able to take from her. If you loved this story of an ordinary tenant who found out her lease bound her to an ancient vampire accord, and a king who finally chose her freely instead of out of obligation, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who loves a slow burn worth waiting for, and subscribe for more dark, thrilling tales of forbidden love every single week.